The Spiritual Brew Pub Podcast will help you navigate spiritually after or during a belief shift, deconstruction, or crisis of faith. Not to try to convert you to a particular destination, but give you the resources you need to evaluate your future belief or unbelief and help you follow the religious historical evidence wherever it leads. I'm your host, Michael Camp, a recovering conservative evangelical, the operative word being recovering, sharing my journey and helping others rebuild faith or a reasoned philosophy of life. So grab your brew of choice and learn how fact-based history helps us both critique and rethink faith. Why do we call it a brew pub? Because we like to hang out in them, at least metaphorically. A pub is a great place to let your hair down, share your true thoughts about your journey, and discuss things with an open mind in a non-judgmental environment. Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and today we have someone much smarter than I as a guest on the podcast. Jennifer Grace Bird is a professor and an author, and she has a PhD in New Testament and early Christianity from Vanderbilt University, among other educational qualifications. Jennifer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Michael. It's just a pleasure to be here.
I'm glad you could join us today. I'm excited because I love your passion for what you teach. You've taught religion, theology, biblical studies, and women and gender studies.
Yes.
Places like Greensboro College, University of Portland, Oregon, and Hollins University. But what stands out to me, and one reason I wanted to have you on the podcast, is that you invite others to think honestly about the role that the Christian Bible plays in the world, and you encourage people to think for themselves about what is and what is not in the Bible. So I think that's very needed today, because I'm sure, that's why you do it.
That is it.
Right, because I'm sure in both of our experiences, we used to, at least I used to be, who am I to question the Bible when I first came into the church? It's just like, oh, okay, you just agree with everything that is said about it. So, but other people really sometimes don't think for themselves when it comes to the Bible. They just follow their church's statement of faith or doctrines, and they don't allow themselves permission to ask the questions that may be gnawing at them. So we're going to talk about two of your books. One of them's been published for a while, and that one's called, I love the title, Permission Granted. Take the Bible into your own hands. And then a new book coming out later this year called Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say?
Yes.
So we're going to get into that. And before we do, though, I want to start with your story. What's your religious background that led you to get into this field and, become a teacher of the Bible and ancient sacred literature?
Yeah. Well, I actually grew up in a Methodist family. So grew up in a Christian home and a very active family in our church. That was our main community. And when I was a teenager, high school, I kind of got involved in a very in an evangelical organization. I was Young Life. I guess it's okay to
Young
say these
Life,
things.
right? I'm familiar with that.
Yeah. I was
Yep.
involved in high school, and then I was a volunteer all through college and on staff for 2 years afterwards. So I was very engaged in a much more almost a fundamentalist way of reading the Bible, and it was very exciting because it's very charismatic kind of an organization and very energetic, and I liked that. And I also started reading the Bible differently than my faith tradition previously had taught me to. So I was reading much more literally in general, not across the board, but what had previously been okay in my life was no longer, such as having women in leadership. I had
Right.
female pastors growing up in the Methodist church, and
Right.
all of a sudden I'm reading, 1 Timothy 2 that says you can't do that, and so I'm like, okay, right, wrong. This is wrong somehow, and yet I have these really strong women in my life, including my mother, who are becoming ordained, and I don't know what to do with it because I believed at that point, right, that scripture dictates how we live, not you dictate not this engagement with scripture, like experiences and
Hmm.
tradition and history, but scripture comes first. And so I was memorizing scripture, as I'm sure you did, Michael, memorizing it. This is
Yeah.
what rules the day for me.
Right.
And then I had someone show me how reading the Greek, learning and understanding the Greek could lead to um, a different understanding of a particular story. And they showed me using the Mary and Martha story. And it was in such a way that it just dramatically shifted my connection to scripture, because someone showed me a way of engaging the original stories as close as we have, that gave an all like a radically different meaning to the story. And it just kind of opened up my whole world. I was like, wait a minute, if this thing that's attributed to Jesus that I have held on to can be so dramatically shifted by looking at what the Greek is saying, what else is out there for reconsideration? Like, what else am I missing?
Right. Right.
So that's what sent me to
That would
seminary.
I could see how that would kinda turn you on. I did the same kind of a thing, you understand that, like, you're reading your Bi English translations,
Yeah,
and then you realize that, oh, actually, some of these translations are disputed.
right, right. Or there might be a
They
nuance.
don't all say, "Yep, that's exactly what it means, and that's exactly what it says,"
Right,
and so then you realize how important it is to go back to the original Greek as far back as you can go, because we don't have the originals,
right.
and find out what it really says, and also in the context of the culture of that day, what it means. Yeah, so
Right,
I oh,
right.
that's great, 'cause I have, that same experience,
Did you?
uh,
Yeah,
I mean, and once you get into it, it just opens up a whole new world,
it does.
so, you know, um, when you look at the Bible, you just described it a way, that you learned in young life, and I know
Mhm,
I learned that in the evangelical churches that I went to.
mhm,
It's the be end all, and
mm.
it says God, that means God said it, and we have to believe it, and we
Yeah,
can't really question it. So,
right.
but if you were going to make the argument that that's really not the best way to approach the Bible, what would it be? Like, what are the main reasons you think it's untenable to view the Bible as this perfect, altogether accurate word of God?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, 2 Timothy 3:16 says it, right? All scripture
Right,
is God-breathed,
right,
right?
right.
And I actually addressed that particular verse, in a section in the book, in Permission Granted, because it is so central to the way so many people do read and think about the whole Bible. But what I think, for me, what it somewhat boils down to is, if we think of the Bible as inerrant and perfect in every way, we're really putting it on the same level as God itself, as God's self,
Right.
right? Um, without being conscious of that. So we're doing that even though we're not really aware, but we're defending the Bible that as being perfect in the same way that God is perfect.
Mhm.
And for me at least, it affects what I expect to see in when I read the Bible, and it affects what I'm allow myself to consider in relation
Mhm.
to the Bible. So,
Mhm.
you know, when I think of, as you said, if I, when I believed that it was all dictated by God to a bunch of humans, right? That they were
Mhm.
in a sense channeling,
Yeah.
right? What
Right.
God wanted them to write. That's how I
Right.
really genuinely believed it. That meant that I had to just trust everything that's going on in there, and that the Bible speaks to itself. The Newer Testament writings can speak to things, 1,000 years older than it, and a very mystical, beautiful kind of a way. And so that kept me from considering the human influence in the writings, and it
Right.
kept me from considering, you know, the the situations out of which these things were written. It kept me from being honest about what the Bible actually is and is not. That's kind of the what I boil
Mhm.
it down to, I think,
Mhm.
for myself,
Mhm.
and talking with others. And in particular, as you said so nicely, Michael, it I think it keeps us from asking questions, or even from, you know, I mean, I saw someone post on Twitter this last week. He said, "I'm feeling really vulnerable, but I need to say that I don't like that Jesus let Lazarus die so that he could make a point."
Yeah.
And I said, "Actually, I don't think you should need to feel vulnerable for being honest about the fact that that seems kind of lousy."
Yeah. Right, right.
And so for him, as for so many, it was, we can't challenge what we find in the Bible because it's perfect and no, it actually isn't perfect. It tells us more about what the people were doing and thinking and eating than anything else, right? And
Right.
so, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we discover when we give ourselves permission
right?
is just exactly that. That there's some big problems in the Bible, contradictions. There's also very many beautiful, inspirational stories. So we've
Yes.
got this
Yes.
mix. And so, how do you deal with it? Now, the
Right.
traditional way of dealing with it and the conservative Christian way of dealing with it is just try to harmonize everything.
Right.
Everything has to be harmonized. So
Right.
that's not really a contradiction, or that's really you're just misinterpreting, or the great one that fall back on God's thoughts are not our thoughts.
Exactly. God's ways are higher than ours.
So we have to just accept it, right?
Yeah.
So, you got that problem when we'll talk about it, but you get into the violence and all the stuff and,
Mhm.
and some of the ugly parts of the Old Testament.
Mhm.
But uh, there's another thing that's going on, and that's uh, that there are translations in the Bible that I've discovered that are biased.
Mm.
And
Mm.
you go back and you look at the original Greek and you go, wait a minute, that's not a good translation.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could just share some examples from your experience of biased translations in the
I
Bible.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And what's interesting is actually sometimes what's more impactful are the headings that the translation committees come up with that essentially direct our thoughts before we even get into the passage. So for instance, there are two that stand out for me. One is, if you look at Genesis 3, and if it has a heading, it will likely say something about original sin or man's sinfulness or fall or disobedience or some sort of leading description like that, right? Well, I don't read Genesis 3 as being about disobedience or original sin or even something horrific. I read it as a rabbi taught me to read it, which is, this is a story that helps to explain a differentiation between humans and other mammals.
Hmm.
And one of the things about us is that we do have a conscience, and that is problematic some days. It's a bummer to have a conscience some days, but
Yeah.
it's also really helpful and important. Um, so, the history of the tradition of the Christian church that has taught so many people to think of Genesis 2 and 3 as being about humans being bad and disobedient and sinful, that in and of itself is so heavily laden, so theologically driven, and yet it isn't really what the story is talking about.
Right.
So for me, that label, and I have students, I will walk students through a different way of reading Genesis 2 and 3 than that, and it's just so deeply ingrained in them because it's what they've always heard since, for so many of them, right? They've just grown up with it. This is about original sin. This is about humans being disobedient. And I don't think it is. I think there are many things, and you alluded to it in some of our exchanges. One of the most powerful things for me, and this is kind of jumping ahead, but it came up prior to writing my third book, is when I realized that in both the Hebrew in the Older Testament or the Hebrew Bible and in the Greek in the Newer Testament, there aren't separate nouns for wife instead of woman
Right.
or for husband instead of man. And
Right.
there isn't, in the Hebrew Bible, there isn't a verb to marry. Um, and so any of the language that we have in the Hebrew Bible that talks about marrying, that should be removed, in my opinion.
Hmm.
It should be
Hmm. Hmm.
taking. It
Hmm.
should be dwelling with, whatever
Hmm.
the verb is,
Right.
instead of changing it in light of our current context and
Right.
presuppositions about this relationship.
Right.
We should remove all verbs of marry. We should remove all labels of husband and wife, because our current understandings of those relationships are different from theirs.
That's right.
And then the other really powerful one I wanna mention before we move on is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the heading for that chapter almost always, not all I think there might be 1 or 2 out of the 50 English translations I consulted that didn't say something about marriage. But people usually have a heading that says, "This is advice about marriage," or, I'm like,
Mhm.
"No, no, it's not. It's advice about whether or not you should marry, or if you are married, whether or not you should engage in sex." That is the boiled down
Mhm.
what that chapter is about, and it is advice about these things from a man who claims to have never had sex.
Mhm.
So, it's not about like, ask 5 of your friends, married couple friends, or your 5 couples. What's the top advice you would give someone about marriage? And sex will probably be in there, but it's not the only thing.
Right, right.
And that is all that chapter is doing, is talking about sex and whether or not engaging in it is a problem.
Mhm.
Like, that is so misleading.
Right, exactly, yeah. Right. No, the headings is really huge because like you said, I mean, those weren't in the original.
Exactly.
You're adding something to the Bible. Actually, the verses and the
Exactly.
chapter divisions aren't there either. So
Right.
so you're and this is what happens. I mean, right? I mean, you have people who start with some presuppositions because they already have a theology,
Exactly.
and then they read that theology into the Bible passage rather than derive something fresh from the Bible passage and let the chips fall where they may. Is that
Exactly.
what's happening?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, people's
right.
presuppositions. When I show students in Genesis 2:24 where, it's talking about the first human that's created, and then God takes some stuff out of its side and makes a second, and therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his woman.
Mhm.
And almost without fail, people's jaws drop up. "What do you mean? He clings to his wife." I'm like, "No, he doesn't. He doesn't get married." And it's like, "What?" There's no marrying happening in there, folks. But you've been taught that because it implies they have sex next, and you can't have sex before marriage. Like,
Right. Yes. Right,
so
right, right.
powerful, so
Yeah, right.
powerful,
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and so there's the argument about, how do you translate? There's the dynamic equivalent
right?
theory, which
Right.
I think in many cases is good, but in some cases it's probably not good. Like you
Right.
just gave a good example of that. Just assuming that, well, that means marriage to us without realizing that we're bringing all this baggage in to what we think marriage is that wasn't there when these people were writing this text.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so that's very important. But,
And I
go
oh,
ahead.
sorry, I know you probably wanna move on, but I also am struck by certain points in scriptures where the English translators, because I only read really in English or look at the original languages, will tone down the intensity when it's scary, or they will
Mhm.
tone down, like in First Peter 3, when it's talking to women and it's saying, "Your daughters of Sarah, if you do what is good," and my translation is, "And then not frightened by terrifying things." Well, every single English translation tones that down so that, that you're not scared of terrifying. Like, I don't even know, but it's like the dynamic equivalent that you refer to, like, people tend to wanna make it nicer, wanna make it more
Right,
palatable,
right.
not just misleading at times, but like,
Yeah,
"Oh, well, that was back then, and they needed extreme language. We don't need extreme language, so let's tone this down."
yeah.
So there's this disconnect.
Sanitize it, yeah.
We're not realizing that we're getting these ideas from very extreme positions and ideas, and that thing about the scriptures, that's important for us to pay attention to instead of sweep under the rug and pretend isn't there,
Right,
it
right.
seems to me.
I just thought of a question that I should have asked you before, but
Okay.
do you refer to Ann Nyland's New Testament, the Source New Testament?
I am not familiar with it yet.
Oh, you should check it out.
Okay.
Ann Nyland, I think she's called a lexicographer,
Okay.
and she wrote a translation of the New Testament. It's called the Source New Testament, and
Okay.
it's got these great notes. It just explains so many things about, some of the things we're talking about, like what's the culture of the day? this is actually the reason why it says this is because this is the way they thought about this thing, and
Yeah.
it clears up a whole bunch of things.
Sounds really valuable. Yeah,
Yeah,
sounds like a very
yeah.
valuable resource.
So another thing I wanted to address was, you know, when you learn to look at the Bible this way, you realize that there's actually a lot of myths in the Bible. Now,
Mm.
that's a dirty word for evangelical Christians, a
It
myth,
is, it
right?
is. It's
It
scary.
shouldn't be a myth. I mean, it
Mhm.
shouldn't be a dirty word because
Right.
myths are all in ancient literature. There's all kinds of creation myths. There's all these things, and myths are useful to explain how something happened, but they're not. They shouldn't be taken absolutely literally because they're using all kinds of language and metaphors and all kinds of things that really we know can't be true. There is no such thing as a talking snake. I mean, whatever,
Mhm.
whatever example you could give. So,
Mhm.
why is it not disrespectful to the Bible to call
Mhm.
some stories myths?
Right. So one of the reasons, as you so nicely noted, one of the reasons people think that it is disrespectful is because of an understanding of this term myth that is not fully filled out, right? When people tend to hear the word myth today, they think of something that's a lie, that's not true.
Mhm.
You're just a
Mhm.
fairy tale, kind of putting it on those
Right. Yeah.
levels. And and I also think about prior to my graduate school training, I thought of something like the Greek myths, the Greek and Roman myths,
Mhm.
and I thought of those stories as on par with fairy tales, and that's just those ancient people and their ideas of how the world works, but that's different from the way my traditions stories about God and humanity are. My tradition stories about God and humanity are real and true. Theirs are just a bunch of stories. And
Mhm.
I made that
Yeah. Right.
distinction,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I will not forget the day I went to Athens as a kinda gave myself a little present for finishing graduate school, and I stood there and looked at the remains of a temple to Zeus,
Mhm.
and I just thought, "You don't build a temple like this to a figment of your imagination. You
Mhm.
believe that Zeus is real
Mhm.
in the same way that I believed that Jesus and God were real."
Mhm.
And it just, so it it just shifted something dramatically for me about what we associate with that word myth. And so when we look at an academic understanding of the word myth, these are stories that people came up with, inspired or not, however you want to understand that. They're trying to give their children a story to explain why the rainbow comes up in the sky after it
Right.
rains. They're
Right.
trying to explain, you
Mhm.
know, w that snakes are bizarre. Like, how is it that they do that? How do they move? Like, that is wild.
Right. Right.
Where did that come from? How did that happen? We have a story that tries to give some sort of explanation. And or we have stories that explain why we do this particular cultural practice. Academically speaking, technically speaking, those are myths, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a challenge to your faith. No one's trying to be deceptive. These are stories that people came up with. And so the hang up is really our own misunderstanding of the word myth, right? And again, Michael, I'm sure you can appreciate this. I walk through all of this with my students in Hebrew Bible intros,
Mhm.
and many of them are like, "Oh gosh, that's so helpful," and it actually frees me up a little bit.
Yeah.
But
Right.
but
Right.
but some of the conservative, very evangelical conservatives are just holding on, and they're still offended
They're
by it.
struggling with it. Yeah.
They're very
Right.
yeah, and I
Mhm.
get it, right? It took me some
Yeah.
time to
Yeah.
work it all
Yeah.
out, right?
You're programmed to think that way, and
Totally, and
yeah.
and you don't change your thinking overnight,
No.
especially when it's so deeply
Right.
connected, right?
But I think one of the distinctions that people need to learn to make, and conservatives typically can't make this distinction, is between what's the difference between like reading some story about talking snakes or
Mhm.
whatever, walking on, going across the Red Sea or something, and doubting those were real, right? But maybe saying, okay, we can get some lessons from this, but I don't think that's literally what happened. And then everyone's freaking out like, oh, you don't believe the Bible, you're a terrible person.
Right.
And then the distinction between that and just, looking at some of the moral teaching in the Bible, Jesus, for example, who I think was a spiritual genius when he came to talking about, how should we live our life,
Mm.
right? And and just saying, okay, yeah, that touches me. I can understand that. This is a radical, perspective. Love your enemies. Love, you know,
Mhm.
the law of Moses can just be boiled down to the golden rule. Just treat others kindly the way you'd like to be treated, and God's okay, right?
Right.
But
Right.
so you can't. But people have to have the whole thing. They can't. You have to believe everything is literally true. You can't differentiate between those kinds of things. I mean,
Right.
that's a huge issue. I mean, so how
It
do you
is.
like you make the Bible like, okay, let's see what it really says, but at the same time have a respect for it that yeah, we
Yeah.
can learn something from this.
Right. No, you're hitting on such important things, and actually, I've just wrapped up an online course, on the Hebrew Bible, Intro to the Hebrew Bible, and I had these very conservative students who were okay with the content we're talking about all term, and then in the final, I asked them to respond to the fact that there are contradictions in those first 2 creation stories, and he's like, "Well, there's not so, like, he was
Yeah.
okay all term,
Yes.
and then he's like, "No,
Right.
no, no, no. I'm going to," as you said, Michael, he just harmonized everything
Mhm.
instead of being able to take a step back and say, "No, no, the first step for me coming out of this was to acknowledge that they do if we read them historically, they do contradict each other. So let's
Right.
acknowledge that
Mhm.
and that takes some time, and then move on to but that doesn't have to destroy your faith. We can have a different engagement, a different way of thinking
Right.
about what these scriptures are doing,
Right.
which is addressing 2 different sets
Right.
of ideas or 2 different needs or 2 different descriptions about, you know, the created world, given this context of the first 2 creation stories, or,
Right.
looking at the Gospels in the Newer Testament and seeing that there actually are a couple contradictions, like, in the Synoptics, Jesus eats the Passover meal. In John's Gospel, he's dead before the Passover meal. That's an outright contradiction,
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a great example. Yeah.
right? So
And
let's acknowledge that
yeah,
first.
and there's a simple explanation for it, but people don't
Right.
want to go there.
Exactly.
John is probably right, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke are probably wrong. I mean, you could argue that. You could say that, because it makes more sense that he was crucified before the Passover because otherwise this is what some historians say, because otherwise the Jewish people wouldn't have had a trial at night, the night of the Passover, right? They wouldn't have been working on that day. So you could just make the argument, yeah, let's choose which one is most likely true and leave it at that. But no one can do that. They have to harmonize everything. So, but that's just not being, in my mind, being respectful to the Bible.
Exactly.
You're actually being
I
disrespectful
think so
to it.
too. I think
Yeah,
so too. You're when
right.
you harmonize instead of let them say what they're saying
Just say what they're
because they're
saying, let the
trying to
chips
tell
fall
you
where they
something.
are, and say, "Hey,
Yeah.
you know what? Some people got it wrong."
Or but also that whole thing about right and wrong doesn't actually need to be a part of the picture, right?
Mhm,
Back to
mhm,
what you were saying, Michael. The synoptics are doing a particular thing. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are doing something that is different than what John is doing.
mhm,
Let's let them all do their thing instead of saying one is right and one is wrong. What is
mhm.
it communicating? That he was
Right,
there for the Passover meal in these gospels and that something else happened, yada yada. What is
right.
John doing? Which is I happen to think John is the one who is messing with any kind of
Yeah,
factual data, but
right.
because it's so theological, it's not, he's is so different and but, let's let John do his thing and say what it's saying, and it's different, and let's acknowledge that they're different instead of trying to say, "But they're all saying the same thing at the end of the day,"
Right,
because
right,
they're not.
right. It's true. Yep, absolutely. So, I mean, for me, the biggest contradiction is
Mm.
the violence of, let's say, the book of
Mm.
Joshua,
Mhm.
Numbers
Mhm.
25. I mean, there's a
Mhm.
thread of what I call violent sacrificial religion,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
God something goes wrong, someone's disobedient, someone's a heretic, someone's a pagan that are idolaters, we have to literally kill them.
Mhm.
Literally,
Mhm.
have capital punishment and kill them. And there's tons of examples in this, and this
Mhm.
the war, the Canaanite conquest, and everything. So, and then compare that to the love ethic of Christ. It's just like night and day. So, so I mean, you know, uh, to me, that one is so blatant, but people still can't get over that. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean,
Mm.
is how have you explained that huge contradiction to your students?
Well, it's interesting the way you put that because I actually also try to push people to look a little closer at the love ethic that you've
Mhm,
just referenced, and most
mm,
of that comes from John,
mhm,
and I actually have a bit of an issue with the Gospel of John because it's so dualistic,
mhm.
which is not helpful for adults, right? Dualisms are very helpful for children, but once we grow to maturity, we need to have we need to have some wiggle room for ethical
Yes,
engagements,
right.
and so but also, if you look at, John 3:16, no, keep reading through 18, right?
Mhm,
Because it makes it very clear that if you're not on the right side, God's wrath is gonna be poured out all over you, thank you very much. And
mm,
so even the love ethic in the Newer Testament
mhm.
is immersed in a somewhat vengeful, violent framework as
Yeah, there is
well.
some of that. Mhm,
So that's actually how I go about it, is I talk about the God of the Hebrew Bible and the God of the Newer Testament as both having some love and both having some pretty intense violence or vengeance. I mean, right hand and left hand, if you're on the right hand, things are great. If you're not, you're doomed to hell and and for suffering
right.
forever. Like, no, actually I'm not okay with that.
Yeah,
That's a
right.
scare tactic, right?
Yeah,
To
it
get
is.
people to
Yeah.
conform. And then but then more specifically to your question about the violence in the Hebrew Bible, I think when we look at the context and we look at the people, I think there's a bigger conversation to have there about this is a small group of people who are trying to stake some claim, want to actually have their own land or be able to establish themselves as a nation, and they're having to contend with all these stronger forces coming in or coming through the region and conquering them, generation after generation. And so there is a lot of violence. And so they depict their God as more powerful, therefore more violent and more vengeful and more,
Right,
victorious. Dun, dun, dun,
right.
dun.
Yeah,
This God is a warrior God who will deliver your enemies into your hands. I mean, there's a moment or a place in time where that is helpful for the people to believe, even if it's not true.
right.
It's a helpful depiction, and
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, people write history to make themselves look good generally, and
typically, what's that saying,
typically,
right?
yeah,
Written
right.
by the
So,
victor? Yeah, written
yeah,
by
they
the
made themselves look really good. I mean, and
absolutely.
God's the most powerful God, and you better not mess with him because he's gonna use us to destroy you. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
anyways, we'll move on, but just one comment. I mean, I'm a Christian Universalist, so I
Okay.
think there's a really, really good case that Jesus never did teach hell and the eternal
Sure,
punishment.
sure.
And Ann Nyland's book really gets into the Greek
Huh,
of those terms,
sure.
all the terms
The
for hell:
Gehenna, mhm,
Gehenna, Hades, and
mhm,
Tartarus, and then Ionis, Colossus, eternal punishment. So those are in my mind, those are totally mistranslated.
mhm, mhm.
And there's evidence for it. So,
Right, right.
um, all right, so let's move on. How about marriage in the Bible? This is a really interesting topic. Right. So why should we revisit the concept of marriage in the Bible? Isn't it straightforward? You've already answered that a little bit, but maybe go
Yeah.
into more depth to that.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question because so many people think that it is, right?
Yeah.
Um, I'll say that one of the things that I've discovered is helpful to talk about is, this label, biblical marriage.
Mhm.
So, as a kind of a preface to the whole conversation about this, why should we reconsider? Because
Mhm.
when um what is it that people think a biblical marriage will look like? And I ask people to think through that for themselves. What do you think that means? Even if you don't use the label, for people who use the label, what does a biblical marriage look like? And they usually say, right, it's between a man and a woman who have children. There's no divorcing.
Mhm.
End of,
Right.
this is it. And the thing is, there are 4 passages in the Bible, 2 from the Hebrew Bible, actually 2 from Genesis, 1 from Matthew, and 1 from Ephesians that people draw from to support this particular
Mhm.
rendering, this particular idea. So in the book that I've written, I actually go into some depth in looking at the context of those 4 passages and show how those passages themselves are not actually endorsing the belief that people think it's endorsing. But then I also, in the other 2 sections of the book, I look at what do marriages actually look like in the Bible, in both testaments? And then what are some other conversations that we should be including in this idea of biblical marriage or marriage according to the Bible? Because if people today do want to say that they are espousing what God intended or that
Mhm.
they're espousing a biblical idea.
Mhm.
And so at the end of the day, when people say they think that a biblical marriage is between a man and a woman, they're committed to each other, yada, yada. One of the things I like to say back is, there isn't an example in the either testament, primary
Mhm.
testament of the Christian Bible that espouses 2 equals
Mhm.
willingly
Mhm.
engaging in something out of love. That is not a biblical example.
Right.
There is not a biblical example that says that.
Well,
So, I am
there
fine with people wanting that, but that's not biblical.
yeah.
So, if we have to only embrace something that's biblical, then you gotta get rid of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, what marriage is just contracts between the men? I mean
Exactly. Exactly, and
Right.
that's why we need to reconsider
Yeah.
what marriage is in the Bible. It's
Right, right.
not what people want it to be or desire today. And I think that's okay and good that we don't want to see women as property.
Well, that's true. I mean, there's a lot of
Right?
things in the Bible that I mean, the Bible didn't call for the
Exactly.
abolition of slavery. They might have
Exactly.
humanized it a bit in the New
Right?
Testament,
A
but
little.
we finally figured out we really should abolish slavery, even though it wasn't biblical. I mean, that's that's people don't realize that these things. They just think that, oh well, they don't think about them in a way that really understands what's going on in the original mind of the people who are actually writing these texts.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So okay, well how about some what are some of the surprising things that you discovered about marriage when you started looking at this?
Yeah. Well, and I did already touch on one of them, but I wanna go back to it just briefly
Yeah.
because it's when I started to think through so the issue of there isn't a separate noun for wife as compared to woman
Right.
or for husband as compared to man. That's not entirely true, but for the sake of our conversation, it is. There are 2 nouns actually for husband, but they both mean lord or master.
Oh,
So, yeah, so that's,
yeah.
we could say that if you want, but it's still not the kind of relationship most
That's
people today want,
right.
right?
Right.
But what I the reason I wanted to circle back is when I started rereading scripture, removing or replacing all of those nouns and verbs,
Mhm.
it really started to like build up and just kind of it was just, I started reading through Genesis and just said man and woman instead of husband and wife and take because it's a man, as you know, Michael, a man takes a woman for
Right.
himself,
Right.
purchases her, or just takes her.
Right.
And so I started reading through scripture that way and it's like, it's so extensive. It is so much. It's just it shifts the way you read these dynamics, and it's a
Mhm.
big deal to me as a lover of texts to honor, as we were saying before, what it's really saying. Um, but, I think what more than I mean, that was a big deal. That was a really big deal, actually, to me. But then even more than that was when I just sat down and let myself be honest about what Paul and Jesus do and do not say. That is a game changer.
Yeah.
It's a game changer. What does Jesus actually say about marriage?
Mhm.
A stunningly small amount, first of all.
Mhm.
He doesn't ever speak positively about it. The
Mhm.
one thing he does say about people in marriages, no, the 2 things. One is it's fine to leave them to follow him.
Mhm.
And the other is what we see in Matthew 19. It's also the parallel stories. It shows up a couple other times, one other
Mhm.
time in Matthew 5, but also in
Mhm.
Mark. But when Jesus talks about marriages, he also uses the Hebrew Bible paradigm, which is
Mhm.
a man purchases a woman, and the way a man shows that this woman is his is by having sex with her.
Mhm.
It's very territorial. It's
Mhm.
very the way we know these 2 are a pair is he had sex with her.
Mhm.
Sex in the Bible is talked about as very transactional, and it is primarily a thing a man does to a woman.
Mhm.
And then Jesus talks in that passage, he's approached by some Pharisees about which reason for divorce he's okay
Right.
with.
Right.
And one of the things that was surprising to me, so you may have been well informed on these things, but I wasn't until I started looking
Mhm.
into this. I wasn't aware that Jesus is for the first couple verses in that exchange in Matthew 19, it starts in verse 3 and it goes through verse 12. When people quote from it for biblical marriage, they quote verses 4 and to 6.
Mhm.
So they're not even taught. So anyway, so they approach him and they say, "Which reason are you okay with?" Well, what Jesus is saying is he's just trotting out the conversation that rabbis and Jews were
Yeah.
having
There was a
already.
debate going on
He's
about
not saying anything new yet, right?
yeah. Mhm.
He's trotting out what's
Mm.
already established. He's not establishing these claims. He's referencing claims that Jews were already
Mhm.
making. The only thing that he says that's new is the part about eunuchs in verse 12.
Mhm.
And so he's going back and forth with the Pharisees. He says one thing, he's like, "Yeah, well, then what about why did Moses give a certificate
Mm.
divorce?" And he says, "Well, because of this." But again, all of this is still pre-established banter.
Mhm.
And then he says, the disciples are like, "Well, if that's the case, it's better not to marry to begin with." And he does not talk them off their ledge. He
Yeah.
says, "That's right. Anyone who can handle it, here's the story. Some
Yeah.
men were born
Right.
eunuchs, some
Right.
men were created, some choose to make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Anyone who can handle it, do likewise." And what's interesting is the church tradition has interpreted that saying about eunuchs as meaning a reference to celibacy.
Mhm.
There is not a single eunuch who is celibate.
Right.
Not in the first century. That is not why you make yourself a eunuch either,
Oh,
potentially.
okay. Alright.
Women loved knowing that the man was a eunuch because it was great birth control, but they could
Mhm.
still have sex. They could still
Mhm.
have intimacy. They could
Mhm.
both still have pleasure.
Mhm.
Becoming a eunuch is not about celibacy. It's really more about something else.
Interesting. Okay. I've never heard that
It's
one.
really more about
Oh,
procreation.
alright. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the passage about where they're debating about divorce,
Mhm.
and from my research, there was a debate going on. It was like, okay, can you just divorce for any reason at all? Any
Right.
matter divorce, it's called, or do you have to have a good reason? And
Yeah.
the way I read it is Jesus says, no, you have to have a good reason. You can't just throw women out the door. I mean,
Just 'cause she burned dinner last night. Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So he is taking a side, but like you said, he's not. He's taking a side that was already there, and he's
Mhm.
making it, and he's actually giving women more rights in one
Mhm.
sense, because
Mhm.
it's like, hey, you're not supposed to be treated like property. You don't treat women like prop property. Just
Well,
uh,
to a
but he's
certain degree. Yeah.
but he's not also not just saying, like most conservatives say, oh, there's only one reason for divorce, and that's
No.
adultery or whatever.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
and Ann Nyland actually has a lot of good commentary on those passages that
Oh,
were
great.
very good to learn. But
Yeah. Good. I
um,
I do wanna say one thing about that as
yeah,
well,
sure.
and that is even in the midst of that, and I think you're right. I think you're right to point out that he is he is trying to like, I think his stance is much more, humane, right?
Yeah,
No, you
right.
don't get to just divorce your
Yeah,
woman and move on, right?
right.
I agree with you. But even in the midst of that whole conversation, which is a conversation between men, right? He still endorses the biblical idea that the reason that you can't divorce, the reason divorcing is a problem is because one or both members of the former marriage are going to go marry other people, which means you'll have
Right.
sex with other people.
Right, right.
The whole conversation about
Yeah,
marriage in the Bible is centered around sex and who
yeah,
you're having it with.
right.
And it is really still about the woman's body and territory.
Yeah,
It really is.
right, right. No, that I understand that
Mhm, mhm.
there's th there's things that, we read in the Bible that are really you wonder why you wonder why didn't Jesus address slavery, let's say,
Mhm,
you
mhm.
know? He never talked about homosexuality either. He
Right,
never talked
right,
about there's a lot of
right.
things he didn't talk about.
Mhm.
And so you realize that, wait a minute, we can't just rely on these texts to help us
Yes, exactly,
form an ethic. We
exactly.
have to go beyond them.
Yep. Yeah,
We can use them and we can gain some insight, but we have to go beyond. And so that's
we do. And, honestly, Michael, there were several layers for me in writing this latest book, but also I was invited to be on a panel recently, with a bunch of Hebrew Bible and Dead Sea Scroll scholars talking about slavery in the Bible, and so I was trying to present some of what's said in the Newer Testament on slavery,
mhm, mhm,
Newer Testament and early Christianity, and I was surprised because, there's a certain amount of um, just letting things be. And some of the sayings of Jesus I haven't really interrogated much, because I haven't needed to or wanted to. But, even Jesus, though I agree with you, he doesn't ever just take on the issue of slavery and say it's
mhm,
okay or it's not.
right, yeah,
But he also uses the setting of slavery or of enslavement in several of his stories or parables. And sometimes I think he's critiquing what happens to people, but sometimes, like in the example of what people think of as the 5 wise and 5 foolish bridesmaids,
yeah,
one of my colleagues, Mitzi Smith, wrote a piece on this story, and, she points out that these aren't just bridesmaids. These are probably concubines being given to the man as a part of the wedding package.
oh, okay, yeah,
And so they're more enslaved women, and
right,
what the language so most of us are taught to focus on being prepared. That story
mhm,
is about
yeah,
being prepared.
right,
But what we're not paying attention to is the cruelty in expecting people to always be on ready to go any time of day or night, and the
mhm,
story itself indicates it's really late into the night before he gets there,
yeah,
and yes, some of the people were not prepared and some were, blah, 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 but when you take a step back and you look at the language here, the context here is of the exploitation of humans and this
mhm,
unjust expectation of always serving, always being ready to serve. And what we can see parallels to that in terms of slavery on this continent and the way, working before dawn and past dusk and all these different things. And there's a story where Jesus uses the punishment that might be delivered to a bad slave, to
mm,
a disobedient slave. He uses that to scare people. So
mhm,
even some of Jesus's own words
mhm,
are marred by him not being conscientious of
yeah,
the very thorough presence of enslavement and how he's not challenging it. He's actually using those scenarios at
right,
times to to make to make a point, and that's unsettling to me to
yeah,
think about
yeah,
Jesus not being
yeah,
conscientious of that.
right. Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's
yeah,
normal.
I
It's a
understand
normal
what you're saying.
thing,
It was
right?
that was the culture and he used the
Exactly,
examples of the culture
exactly. So did
and
Paul in his
yeah,
writings, and I think that's an
so
important
right,
thing to
yeah, Yeah,
pay
but they
attention to.
but Paul did say there is no slave or free
He
in
did.
Christ,
He
and
did.
so there was an opening up, okay, let's treat these people like we're all in Christ, we're all equal, you know?
He did say
So
that,
there was
and then
some of that too,
there
so yeah,
was, and then in the
yeah,
literal next chapter, he then reverts back to talking about enslaved and free in a theological way,
yeah,
referring to Sarah and Hagar and their
right,
children.
yeah,
And he calls followers of Christ slaves of Christ, and we
yeah,
are enslaved to God and enslaved to.
right,
So even
yep,
again, I think it's an element of entitlement or just not awareness of the extent to which
yeah,
this language is actually problematic.
right,
Um, and people over the centuries have found ways to accommodate it, right? Of course, I'm a slave to Christ. I'm proud of that, or
yeah,
whatever.
right,
I'm like,
right, yep. Yeah. So
okay.
let's ask one other question about you. We're differentiating this what says in the Old Testament and you call the Newer Testament. Is there any difference? I mean, does the Newer Testament make any switches from the view of marriage in the Old Testament, or is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, I think that it is very much the same. And
Okay.
in fact, if anything, Jesus and Paul are quite anti-marriage,
Yeah.
like at all. So he's, there, Paul, okay,
Well,
so he was anticipating the return
yeah,
of Christ any day, but he says he prefers that you not marry if you can help
yeah,
it.
right.
They're
Yeah, that
actually
there is a uh, scholarly theory that Paul was actually married before and he's just not married now. That most a lot of people say, hey, like good Jews always got married,
right, right.
almost
Well,
always.
so
So anyway,
where does that leave Jesus, right?
but
I mean,
Jesus is like, well, yeah. Where does that leave Jesus? He was still relatively young. I don't know. He knew he was gonna risk his life, and didn't he just he wanted to not have
sure,
a family and
sure.
harm their family, whatever. You could come up with a lot of reasons, but that is interesting.
Well, people really are very uncomfortable considering Jesus actually having had sex
Oh, I
because,
know, that's yeah,
right?
they
So
freak
that's
out with
piece
that,
of
yeah.
that.
That's freak yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Right, so when they shouldn't be, So, okay, let's think about one other thing. Um, when you look at marriage, men and women relationships, the way they're described in the Bible, and you look at the culture and the original meanings of the text, is is there anything redeeming about that we can help
Mm.
inform a ethic on marriage and relationships today?
I gave this question, and I appreciate you giving them ahead of time. I gave it a lot of thought because I would like to be able to find something like that, and I
Mhm,
really just don't. That's the
mhm,
thing. People say, "Oh, a lot of these couples stayed together," and there's something really important about patience and perseverance in a relationship and working
mhm,
through and sticking
mhm,
it out. I
mhm,
absolutely agree with that. But I'm not a big fan of saying, "Well, look, these biblical couples stuck together through their whole lives," because it was a different time and place and different reasons and different like, what were their options? And actually, a rabbi also pointed out this little loophole, if you will, that after Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac, Sarah she's not involved in that story, but also she leaves him. She is elsewhere when she dies. He has to go to her
No,
where she was living
no, that
when
it's
sh
amazing, people totally ignore stuff like that,
yes, yes. So
and the fact that there were 2 other women involved in the
right?
family, I
After
mean
well, when she left, he had yeah. So anyway, so what is it that I think in terms of, I think it's a good like, I keep posting things on Facebook or whatever about, like, this is what marriage is in the Bible, and, like, these really honest, kind people like, "But what about, like, forgiveness and listening?" I'm like, "Yeah, those are good. I like those. It's not biblical.
mhm,
We're not given that example in the Bible." And so I think back to your earlier comment, we need to go beyond. And I think I really want to encourage people to not need the Bible to affirm something in order for it to be okay today.
right, Yeah.
because it affirms a lot of things that we have deemed, as you said earlier, that we have decided is no longer good. And it doesn't affirm a lot of really good things that we've discovered about human
Mhm.
relationships.
Mhm.
The passage in 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, right?
Mhm.
A lot of people have that read at their wedding ceremony.
Mhm.
I know my brother did, and
Mhm.
one of my brothers, and it's beautiful. I also have a problem with some of it because love doesn't actually bear all things. It says no to some abuse, for instance. Um, but that's not addressed to a couple. That's addressed to the community.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. That's really not for a marriage.
It's not.
It's for a community of people. This is the way you
Exactly.
love,
You
and it's a
exactly.
good teaching, but it's not in the context of marriage. It's
Exactly.
right. Yeah.
Is there some stuff there we can work with? Absolutely. So, like,
Right.
so that's the thing.
Yes.
It's like the stuff
Yeah.
that in the Bible that's talking about marriage is almost entirely not useful.
Right. Yeah.
But
The
I
only
think we
thing
need to start there,
yeah, the
right?
only thing I think is the most useful is that Jesus, I think, came out strong against casual divorce.
I think that's
Just
very useful too.
yeah, so
I like that
I think
too.
that was one of the main things that I got out. Is like, no, no, you can't just do that. That and also the equality of women. I mean, if you get into it, there were women leaders in the church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bible translators changed um, words. Junius,
Mhm. Mhm.
Junia was an
Mhm.
apostle, but they changed it to Junius.
Right. Right. And
Uh,
Phoebe is a
Phoebe
deacon,
Phoebe was actually a
a
presiding
minister,
officer
a
in the
minister of
church.
the
They
church.
they
Yeah.
they called it and they,
So good.
it was actually a name for a leader, who presided over a group, who led a group, but they changed it to what? Helper or deacon or something, I don't know.
Servant.
Yeah,
Mhm.
servant, right, yeah. So, there's all that stuff that they changed. So I think that's probably the main thing that I see is more humanizing and equalizing women and being against at least casual divorce that's
Mhm.
destructive.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
like you said, there's still a lot of gaps. I mean, and that's why we need to go beyond, and we can use some of the principles of the love ethic, I think, to go
Mhm,
beyond.
mhm, I think
You
so
know,
too.
yeah.
And, when you reference women in leadership, I when I try to ask my students in Newer Testament intros to look at, there are the genuine Paul doesn't even really seem to know they haven't established roles yet or labels for roles yet. And so he talks about gifts. The Spirit gives gifts as God
Right.
chooses. Use it. There's
Yeah.
no gendered language. There's no, "These are
No.
men's gifts, these are
Right.
women." Nope,
Right.
none of that, right?
No.
But we do get later on, so things are starting to be established and settled in, so we wanna start defining roles, and that's when we start assuming it's only gonna be men. So asking people to think through, we're all choosing which passages we turn to. We're all
Hmm.
choosing which one we're gonna privilege over the other.
Hmm.
When it comes to Paul's writings, Paul has very egalitarian advice. That's the one thing we didn't talk about. He does have some egalitarian advice about marriage when he talks about sex. He
Hmm.
does talk about you don't withhold from each other and you
Right.
kind of belong to each
The
other. I think
women
that's
have a
lovely.
right to it as
I
well. Yeah.
I think
Right.
there's something lovely about that.
Yeah. Right. Hmm.
And then later you have women are to submit to their husbands entirely. Like those are two different
Yes.
ways of seeing this relationship.
And
Let's be honest that they're
yeah.
both in there, right? And why
Yeah.
don't you think about why you've chosen the lens you'd have, why you've chosen that this one is stronger than this one, or that this
Right.
one trumps the other. Why? And just that's a
Yeah.
conversation, an important
Yeah.
conversation to have about the way we all cherry pick,
Yeah.
right?
No, it's true, and we don't get into, like, some of there's some really interesting theories, like, I think it's the First Corinthians one where Paul says, women should be silent. There's 2 prevailing theories. One is that actually was inserted by a later copyist because it doesn't fit, and then the other one is actually Ann Nyland says, "Wait, actually, Paul is just quoting his, adversaries and then saying utter rubbish." They take that word out in the Greek and, basically saying bullshit.
Mhm. I
So
some
I don't know which one is right, but there were some good reasons to reject those passages that talk about, women should be silent because like you said, that's not it contradicts other things that Paul says.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's really fascinating to me how complex that particular passage is that you've just
Yeah.
referenced, and it's
Right.
in 1 Corinthians 11,
Yeah.
2 to 16. And I've actually published an article on that, and I actually, in my book,
Okay.
Permission Granted, have a particular stance that's similar to Nyland's, it sounds like.
Okay.
And then I had to reconsider a book written by Anne Wire called The Corinthian Women Prophets. And
Mhm.
she looks at whether or not that was, an insertion, the passage
Yeah.
you're talking about, the
Yeah.
33 to 36. And it's very complicated. Textually speaking, she has done amazing work. If anyone is really interested in getting to the bottom, I think her work is essential. It's
What's her
also
name?
Antoinette Clark Wire,
Okay.
The Corinthian Women Prophets. The thing is, it's very academic. It is
Yeah.
difficult to sort through. But her point is, Paul has egalitarian moments, but he's also kind of annoyed with the female prophets in Corinth,
Yeah.
and his sexism comes back out.
Yeah.
And so however
Right.
you wanna deal with
Yeah.
it, I think it's
Yeah.
important to note that, like many of us, we might
Yeah.
have some ideals, and then when we start to see them playing out, we don't like the way they play out, or whatever,
Yeah.
and he's human, and
Right.
he
Right.
kinda backslides, I think, a little bit on his egalitarian
No, it's
stance,
true.
and
He even claimed that Peter backslid. So if
right.
Peter could backslide, Paul can backslide, right? Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's just that, these people are still human beings, and
Humans.
they're in a vastly different culture than we are in. I
Exactly.
mean,
Exactly.
incredibly different.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, this has been a great
It
conversation,
has, it
Jennifer.
has.
I
Thank
appreciate
you.
you joining us.
Thank you for
And
having me.
yeah, you're welcome. So what's your URL for your website where people can find your books,
Yeah.
and you also have some great videos, by the way.
Thank
I
you.
want to promote.
I
But
appreciate that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
My website is my full name, so Jennifer with 2 N's, IFER, Grace Bird. It's just
Okay. .com.
jennifergracebird.com.
.com.
Yeah, and
All
I
right.
do. I have a YouTube channel, and I have a video series actually that I created for communities of faith. I had
Mhm.
United Methodists and Presbyterians in mind, to try to help people work through the biblical passages that are related to marriage in the Bible.
Okay.
Kind of the content of my book essentially fleshes it out even further. But for
Right.
people who want to sit down and have conversations about, okay, I'm fine with whoever wants to marry can marry, but I don't know what to do with the Bible. I think the Bible says these things, like kind of reconciling your
Right.
personal conviction and what to do. So that's what that series is about. And I'm trying to help people do that. And you can find that on my website
Do you
also.
do you get into the polygamy and all that concubinage and all that stuff?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I don't. That's an interesting question because it's hard to address that well.
Right. Yeah. That's a whole nother realm
It
where
is.
people totally ignore.
It is. These women are purchased purely for sex.
I mean,
What?
and then there's, I mean,
Or for allegiances between groups of people or whatever,
right,
right?
right, and it's and there's all kinds of things that the adultery is a different definition for men than women, etc.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
It's like, yeah, well, people just don't even pick up on this stuff, but it's
Right.
there.
Yep.
So I'm really excited to. I'm looking forward to your book. Now, when is it going to come out? The one, Marriage
Not
in the Bible. What do the texts say? When does that come out?
not until November at this
November.
point.
November. Okay,
They
so
have
still
a
a ways to go. But folks,
unfortunately.
go to Jennifer's website, jennifergracebird.com. Lots of videos on this topic, and she's an excellent teacher, and you can really learn a lot from her. So,
Thank
Jennifer,
you.
thanks for joining us on the Spiritual Brew Pub. I was drinking coffee this morning, but in the evenings, sometimes we have beer over here.
I'm
So
sure.
or wine.
Uh-huh.
So, but I would love to have you on again when the book comes out and
Thank
have a
you.
chance to read it and everything. We can go more in depth. So
I'd
maybe we'll
love
plan
to.
for that in the fall.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jennifer. Folks, thanks for joining us again on the Spiritual Brew Pub. Enjoy responsibly.